Hello? Oh, it works. Thank you. Okay, first off, I'd like to thank you for coming. This is a little weird for me. I'm usually here at places selling my most recent game. This is the first time I've really been talking about myself. In case you weren't aware, I'm Leonard Boyarsky. I'm currently creative director at Obsidian Entertainment, and this is called A Life in Video Games, or more specifically, My Life. These are some of the games I've been fortunate enough to have worked on in the 25 years I've been in the industry. I hope it'll be interesting for all of you guys who are more into the tech side of things to hear how art and design approaches these things. I'm going to be talking about the path that led me into games, the games themselves, how me and some of my friends ended up making our own company, and how I ended up being at Obsidian now. I'm also going to be talking about how accidents, luck, and being in the right place at the right time have played a huge part in my career. As you can see, I cranked my luck up to heroic proportions on my character sheet. In case you don't recognize it, this is from the original Fallout. And this talk is going to be a little bit Fallout heavy because Fallout has the best stories. It was a game blessed by luck, much like my career. I can't stress enough how unique and unlikely Fallout is. It was a bunch of guys who'd never been in charge of making a game before being able to basically do whatever they wanted to. We were given virtual, complete creative freedom. I'm also going to touch on some of the technical challenges that we had to deal with that are quaint and archaic today that you'll never have to face, but also some things that won't change, and some of the things I've learned mostly the hard way. I'll take some questions at the end if any of you are still around by then. I tried to use my art in the presentation as much as possible, and I'll try to remember to point out when it's somebody else's. So let's start at the very beginning. For some reason, when I was 6 years old, I woke up in the middle of the night and drew these. In case you can't tell, that's Charlie Brown and Snoopy. I was very proud of them. So proud, in fact, that I decided on the spot that I was going to be an artist, and no one was ever able to dissuade me from that. And many people tried. So I eventually made my way to college. This was supposed to be a Swatch ad. You guys are probably too young to remember. In the 80s, Swatch was a very popular brand of watch. Swatch was supposed to be the sound effect of that guy being punched. But this was back in the Stone Age before Photoshop. I would have had to hand letter it or send it to a typesetter to get it made, and I didn't have the money for that. I spent way too long in two different colleges getting two different degrees because one just wasn't enough for me, I guess. I also studied quite a bit of philosophy, which actually turns out to be very helpful when you're world building. These are my only two real professional paying jobs. These guys on there who were blindfolded were kicked out of the band after I finished the painting, and the other guys said they wanted their faces covered. So I didn't want to ruin the painting, and once again, no Photoshop. So I had to take a big giant piece of clear plastic and paint those blindfolds on them, and then they had to shoot the film for the CD cover through that plastic. Another thing that's kind of humorous is that guy on the right-hand side with the long blonde hair is now a high school principal. This is first, but definitely not my last time that my failure to find work as a freelance illustrator really helped my career. I finally got a job at Buena Vista Software when I realized that my professional illustration career wasn't panning out, and I thought I'd like to eat. I didn't know how to use a PC at the time, but fortunately the art director who was working there told me he could teach me how to use a computer in 3 days, but he didn't have time to teach me how to be an artist, which was very fortunate because just even a few years later, as we'll see, that wasn't enough. I was the only artist on a kids game starting out. It lasted about 2 months before it was canceled, but they liked me, so that led me to doing this, which is my first actual published video game work. It was eventually released by Maxis because they closed Buena Vista right around the time we finished this game. My job on this was cutting those clay stop-motion dinosaurs out of the backgrounds. It was just me and one other guy, the artist designer of the project. We were working in a room at his house. He would film these with just a standard video camera on the corner of a desk with blue plastic behind it for blue screening. And we had to palette these down to 256 colors. Because when you get video from a just normal video recorder with horrible blue screening, you have all this pixelization going on. And I like to call it the pixel crawl. And you also had this really bad blue bleed from the blue screen on these things. So I couldn't just lasso these areas in Photoshop and change the color on them. I had to go in and match them pixel by pixel. And when you see these things move, the pixels crawl all over the surface of it. So I got very intense and very obsessive about it. I made sure you couldn't tell. It looked all natural. And then I realized after I had done all these that the better I did, the less you could tell I had done anything. People were just like, oh, you cut them out of the background, so what? But luckily, that technique and that knowledge actually really helped me out. This game was about genetically engineering dinosaurs to fight each other or some scientist, I think. I never actually saw the game running. I ended up painting the end screens for Castles 2 after that. This was the losing screen, which ironically looked better from the winning screen, so that's why you're seeing that one and not the other one. This was my first published work for Interplay, which led to me being hired full-time on Stonekeep to cut out backgrounds. I couldn't get a job doing anything else because all I had in my portfolio was these characters I had cut out of backgrounds, so that's what they had me doing. The reason they were doing this instead of using 2D animation was because they had these really, for the time, awesome-looking backgrounds done by a guy named Rob Nessler, who's now an art director at Obsidian. And you couldn't make believable 3D-looking characters, human characters, in 3D at that time. So they filmed the actors against this horrible blue screen. And by actors, I mean producers and secretaries. And they really didn't know what they were doing. The first batch of them, they actually filmed in the parking lot in natural light, which if anybody you know anything about that, that was probably the worst idea, which was lucky for me because then they needed somebody to go in and touch up the pixel crawl and cut them out of the backgrounds. I also got to do little things like do the eyes on that skull down there and a lot of those little icons on the right-hand side. But it was a bit frustrating as, I really wanted to kind of stretch my artistic muscles. So I finally finished cutting all these characters out of the backgrounds, and I'm like, great. I finally get to do some real art. And they came to me, and they're like, well, we kind of had you do it wrong. You're going to have to start over and do all the characters over again. So at that time, I kind of lost it. I really couldn't take it. I guess this actually fits my psychological state at the mind, but I didn't realize it. So I went home at night after work, and I started a new portfolio, trying to get sample book covers going. This is my horror book sample. I did about 4 different kinds, all told. This is my daughter. Her name's Corey Ray. She's 4 years old, and this was how she would look at us when she was in trouble. I can't believe it from looking at this, but she was much more malevolent looking than that at the time. This actually went nowhere. This was the second time not being able to find illustration work helped my career. Because Interplay had bought these. These are Indigo 2 machines. They're SGIs, Silicon Graphics machines. And they were running Power Animator, which was a precursor to Maya. Because Maya had to run on Unix machines. It couldn't run on PCs. They paid $24,000 for each of these machines in 1992 money, and $36,000 to have a Power Animator on each of them. But they forgot one very important thing. They forgot to find out how much people who knew how to use this software made. And the answer is it was way more than anybody was paying artists in the game industry at the time. So these were just sitting in an office, and I'm really frustrated, so I'd go in after work, and I'd teach myself how to do 3D art, which was no mean feat because I had no understanding of what 3D art was all about. I had no internet, obviously. So it was just me by myself all night long in a room with a manual. I'd work 8 hours all day, then spend another 4 to 6 hours at night teaching myself how to do 3D art. And then this is the first 3D art I ever did, the little guy, not the backgrounds. He's very mushy and organic, which is exactly what you don't want to do the first time you're doing 3D art. It's much easier to make solid, hard-edged objects. I did everything with him because he's kind of a proof of concept that I could do it. I designed him, I modeled him, I textured and animated him. I was really flying by the seat of my pants. I had no idea what I was doing, and to get this to work in the first place, I actually had to go in and do a lot of touch-up by hand. But as we all know by now, I was really good at pixel art. I did about 3 or 4 characters and a lot of 3D props. The characters and objects were all sprites. For those of you who don't know what that is, sprites are 2D flat pictures. They look like they're 3-dimensional because we rendered them in a 3D program. But they're just as flat as if we had drawn them by hand. So what we would have to do is we'd render every rotation and every frame of action, and then the engine would just play them in sequence. There was no actual animating or calculating of 3D space or collision or anything like that going on. And the character I just showed you, each of his tentacles was actually considered a different creature by the engine. You had to kill each one of them before you could kill him. So what it would do is I would render out the basic body, and then I would render out all the tentacles separately and place them on top of him. At the end of Stonekeep, I was promoted to lead artist, which I found out when I saw the credits for the game. No one bothered to tell me. But that led me to working with Tim Kaine. Another lucky thing that happened, that I forgot to mention, was that the art director who I was working with on Stonekeep was a fantastic art director. He probably would have been the lead on Tim's game, except for he quit and that left me the last guy standing pretty much. So I met Tim while he was running GURPS campaigns after work. GURPS is a paper and pencil role-playing system. It stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System. He was an awesome GM, which I believe gave him his great design sense. And before Interplay had gotten the Dungeons & Dragons license, Tim had convinced them to make a GURPS game. He started work on it alone and worked on it for about 6 months by himself on the engine. And then he got Jason Anderson, straight out of Toys R Us management. In case you guys aren't familiar with the Toys R Us brand, it's a toy store, obviously. This was very lucky because he ended up being the bridge between tech and art. I had no idea how a lot of this worked. Jason was very technically minded as well as being a really good artist. And again, this was an incredible stroke of luck because he was not hired for this talent. He was hired because he was a good artist. And then after him and Tim had worked on the game for a little while, Tim sent an email out to the whole company. And he told anyone who wanted to come after work to design a brand new game from the ground up. It could be anything we wanted, and he'd give us free pizza to show up. And I showed up expecting a room full of people, and there was only 6 of us. I have no idea to this day why you would not show up to a room where someone said you could design your own video game. So in these meetings, between the 6 of us, we designed basically what the whole gist and framework of this game was going to be. And this is eventually what we came up with. Tim has a really great GDC talk about the nuts and bolts of developing this, including the fact that it was originally meant to be this crazy and impossible to make time travel story. My version is a much less of a top-down overview and much more what I was involved with personally. The most important thing we came up in those meetings was that you had to be able to finish the game one of 3 ways. You had to be able to fight your way through it, talk your way through it, or steal your way through it. We were also committed to letting the player play how they wanted. That was very important to us. We wanted the players' choices that they made to really matter. And this is an approach to the games that all the games that me, Tim, and Jason ended up making together. We wanted a truly branching narrative. A branching narrative doesn't only mean multiple endings. It means multiple paths and multiple drama points along the way. So you're not only making one perfectly crafted story, you're making a hopefully perfectly crafted story with all these different branches and all these different things that can happen in it, and each of them needs to theoretically be as significant as any other path you took. This is something that you don't have to do in any other kind of storytelling. And unlike some of the other tech challenges I've been talking about and will be talking about, this is not going to change until computers have true AI and have enslaved us and made us their slaves. I was assigned to the game as a lead at the time. It was just me and Jason. But I decided since I had been promoted to lead artist without being told, I would just promote myself to art director, which no one ever said I couldn't. Jason and I were really big on the fact that we didn't want it to be a fantasy game because it seemed to us that every RPG was a fantasy game. And we were really big into the Road Warrior, or as the rest of the world knew it, Mad Max 2 at the time. So we convinced everyone to make it a post-apocalyptic game. And Brian Fargo, who was Interplay's owner, really wanted to make it Wasteland 2 after he found out we were doing a post-apocalyptic game. The original Wasteland, for those of you not familiar with it, was a 1980s hit for Interplay, but they were not the publishers of it. That was back when they were developers, so they didn't own the license. So he was unable to get the license to do it, which was very fortunate for us because we got to make our own game. On the game, Tim was a very benevolent dictator. Jason and I, not so much. We were the enforcers who were making sure everything was done right, or at least what our version of right was. This was the original team for the game. We were told we were going to have to make the whole game with this many people because all of the other artists were on Dungeons & Dragons games as well as programmers. That's where they thought the money was. They were making a game called Descent to Undermountain. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. But we were kind of outcasts. This made us feel like kind of outcasts. We were starting with so few people, which actually turned out to be a really great thing because it was a really tight team that we started with. And we were all making the same game, which, believe it or not, is very rare when you're making games. A lot of people feel like they're making a different game. But we were all very committed to this one game we were making. And because this core team was built around the people who had shown up after work and taken their own time and their own initiative to design this game, we were all very passionate and motivated. You can't make a video game alone, and you're only as good as your teammates. So luckily, we eventually got more people. But this is true whether it's for an independent game you're doing for fun or for a little college project or even as a professional. The quality of your work ethic is just as important, if not more important, than the actual work you do yourself. You should always try to be someone on your team that the rest of the team can depend on. You never want to be the weak link. Jason and I wanted to call it Vault 13. Brian Fargo came up with the name Fallout, which we all hated at the time. This guy is the actual isometric little character from the game, which is why he looks so bad. This was just a comp title screen. We never would have shown it like this. But if you notice, there's not much 1950s Fallout style to him. That came along later. And like I said, this was originally supposed to be GURPS. Since GURPS was generic and can be applied to any setting, Tim built the game modularly on an abstraction layer that made calls to the operating system. Ironically, making it to support a generic system made it very easy for us to swap out the skills in combat when we lost the GURPS license. We had a falling out with the GURPS owner over the violence level and the 1950s stuff, especially the Vault Boy. And this was very fortunate, I think, for the popularity of the game because it would have been very niche if we had kept it GURPS. It would have been the best GURPS game ever, but it would have been a very select audience. The most impressive thing for me was that Tim and Chris Taylor, who was our lead designer at the time, designed the new special system and implemented the game from scratch in 2 weeks. If they hadn't, we would have been canceled. Another way this modularly focused abstraction layer saved the game for future generations was that it allowed it to run on NT as well as Windows 95. Because Windows is now based on NT and no operating systems are based on 95. But this gave us a Windows certification issue. What Windows certification is when you send your game over to Microsoft to get the little logo on your box, you have to get them to pass it. And we failed. And the reason we failed was because it didn't degrade gracefully under Windows NT, which confounded us because we thought it ran perfectly under Windows NT. How is that not degrading gracefully? But they didn't want it to run on Windows NT. We have no idea why. So Chris Jones, who was our co-lead programmer with Tim at the time, put a line in the launcher that asked if it was running on NT, and if the answer was yes, it failed. So that was our solution for that. So that makes us sound like we were geniuses. We also did a couple very stupid things. We shipped the game with no copy protection because it filled up a whole CD, which is 750 megs, and no one is going to take the time to copy 750 megs. And even if they did, no one has a hard drive big enough to store all of that information. We could obviously see well into the future. We assumed that the game was going to be a standard Mad Max type setting. These are the original lead designers' concept sketches for the game. We really didn't give it much consideration beyond that. But I had this really long drive between home and work, and it was during those drives that I came up with probably two of the best ideas I ever had. The idea number one was to make it the 1950s future. I wanted to give everything this underlying 50s feel, the feel of the psychology of the 50s, the corporate branding, everything about it. I don't know why I wanted to do this. It was kind of just a gut feeling at the time. I really liked the style. That's about all I could say about that. But looking at it now and wondering why this actually worked was because a lot of the game story, we didn't change any of the game story or anything after I made this decision. But a lot of the story already felt like a very 50s B-movie, science fiction, comic booky thing. And this was just kind of our personalities. This was our fun and admittedly slightly frivolous take on things. The second idea I came up with that I think was pretty good was coming up with the Vault Boy. We had this problem, that was we had tons of tiny icons that were confusing and indecipherable even to me, who was supposed to know what every one of them were. So as I was driving one day, I had this vision of Monopoly cards. And I thought, you know, if we had this skill guy, as I called him at the time, who was just really happy about everything, even if he was dismembered, even if he had just done something really heinous, that it would be fun and kind of really fit the feeling of our game. Needless to say, everyone was a little bit dubious about this idea at the first, but Tim trusted me, which I thank him for. The guy on the left here is the first drawing I did of the Vault Boy to show everybody what I was talking about. I handed it off to a guy named George Almond, who kind of brought it along and made it look more like the Monopoly guy. And after he did that, a guy named Tremel Isaac took over and did all the cards for the game. And again, like the whole 1950s thing, I don't feel like this was something new to the game. This kind of just was a way of encapsulating really what we were already doing in a visual way. As art director, I wanted everything to feel like it was part of the world, the interface, even the manual. I had this thing that I called them found objects. I said everything had to feel like it was an object you could find in the world. I didn't like the 2D gamey flat interfaces that were in all the games at the time. It just kind of separated you from the game. I wanted it everywhere you looked, whether it was the interface, the manual, load screen, minimap. I wanted everything to kind of reinforce this feeling that we were going to. But like Stonekeep, this was still a 2D flat game using sprites. I did all the male hero modeling, texturing, and animating, and Jason did the females. We used 6 directions, and the reason for that is because GURPS is based on hexes, so we had to base it on hexes because we didn't change that after we switched away from GURPS. This made walking straight up and down look very bizarre, so I tried to convince them that we should have 12 rotations instead of 6, but that would have really exploded our character art size, as well as there was technical issues with the hexes that we couldn't get around. This is not technically an isometric angle that Tim likes to point out. It's called cavalier oblique. Jason chose this angle because it looks better than an isometric game. It looks much less flat. Jason also figured out how to base our tiling off of squares that were extrapolated from the hexes because it's near impossible to tile hexes. I probably would have tried if Jason wasn't around, so I thank him for that. On this, in Arcanum, Tim and him really worked a lot together to figure out the best way to get our art to look the best, as well as with the restrictions we had with programming. This was 256 colors, and we had one row of colors reserved for color cycling. If you don't know what that is, it's a bunch of colors in a row, and you put down the first pixel in the screen, and then the game will just cycle through those colors in that one pixel space, and it makes it look like it's animating. It's very good for things like effects and fire. Another thing, I had my history with bad pixelization and pixel crawl. When you paletted things down from true color, you get a lot of pixelization. And instead of just randomly doing it, I tried to find ways of making that pixelization make it look like everything was dirty. Because it's very easy to make things look very plasticky and shiny and clean in 3D. It's hard to make them look dirty. Another problem we had was that in 1995, it was really hard to make good-looking human heads in 3D. But I really wanted to see the characters up close, see the reactions they were having to you as you were talking to them. So we had a guy at work named Scott Rodenheiser who was making sculptures for the Dungeons & Dragons games that they would hand digitize. And I thought that might be a good idea for using for the heads. These were all sculpted by Scott, except for the Overseer. Just because I wanted to do one from the beginning to end, so I actually sculpted that head in clay or in Sculpey and did the texture mapping on it and the animating and the lighting. Most of the other characters I just did texture mapping and lighting on. And then right around the time the art was just about finished, we discovered something very disconcerting, and that the game was mostly empty. I have no idea how it got that far and ended up that way, but the only thing that was in the game was the dialogue that we had already recorded for the talking heads, as we called them. And a lot of that didn't even make sense. I want to stress that the writing of it was all really good. It wasn't the problem with the writing. It's the way the dialogues were structured and how the players' lines were responding to it that made it confusing. As with everything else, like branching narrative or with branching narrative, it's kind of an art unto itself. You don't do a lot of this in any other type of writing, so it was not something that came naturally to a lot of people. We obviously didn't think this was luck at the time, but it changed the trajectory of my career for sure. So me and Jason got to work and we rewrote most of the player lines. Number one, we wanted to get the right feel for the player, but we also wanted to untangle what was going on in these conversations, and we had to untangle a lot of the rest of what was actually in the game. One of the main things we wanted to do in your talk solution was that from the very beginning, we wanted you to be able to talk the master into killing himself. But when I got the dialogue, it really didn't make a lot of sense, the lines you had to pick to convince him to do that. So I used our new player lines and I restructured the dialogue so that it made sense, so you had some kind of logic to the choices you were making. Another very interesting thing, if you ever go back and play Fallout 1, that you'll notice, is next to every character, just about every character that has a talking head and recorded dialogue, there's another character standing very close to them that does not have recorded dialogue, who will tell you the real information that you're supposed to know, because that was another thing that was lacking from the recorded dialogue, was the actual information they were supposed to be giving you in a lot of cases. Just like the Vault Boy or the 1950s stuff, we didn't see this as us changing what was in the game or what the game should be. This was to us just realizing what we had pitched or what we had decided on in those early meetings. Jason and I also wrote a bunch of holotapes and side quests, and we fleshed out quests that had been designed but never were implemented. As you can see, we were dedicated to comically over-the-top violence. I think that guy on fire is a good example of color cycling. But what we had to do with these guys, I had to prove that it could be done. So for instance, that guy melting, none of that is procedural. I just took every part of his body and hand animated it melting. And then I would copy that to all the other characters. And again, the characters were just 2D flat sprites. The engine had no idea of 3D space. So I wanted Gizmo, the fat guy in the bottom corner, to sit at a desk. So that's the whole object. That is the characters, him and his desk. I believe he only had one death because of that. I had to hand blow out his chest and I'll put all that stuff in there. From the beginning, we all had a very unique and twisted sense of humor about the whole thing. But this was just a reflection of the personalities of the people on the team. And really, we just tried to make each other laugh constantly. Tim and I used to quote The Simpsons all the time, which really irritated Jason. So of course in here you can't see it, but the brand of the television is Radiation King, which is the television that Homer Simpson used to watch when he was a little kid. And I put that in there simply because I knew when Tim watched this for the first time he would laugh and Jason would be irritated. I also got a bug from QA that the television wasn't plugged in, as if I could have forgotten to plug it in as I was meticulously modeling this plug and the symbolism of it not being plugged in that you can't even see there. I'm very obsessive about things that no one ever notices. But out of everything, I think two of my most favorite things about the game are the intro and the ending that Jason and I did, because it really gave you the mood and the tone for what the game was. Something else that never changes, I'm not going to make a war joke here. I swear I didn't write it that way, it came out that way. It's something that doesn't change is you have to design around constraints. And contrary to what you would think, constraints are really good and not having constraints is bad. Without constraints, you can end up taking 6 years to make an action RPG, for instance. I don't know who would have done that. So with our constraints with this was that we wanted to show people, but showing people up close, like I've said, was very difficult. So we decided, hey, we'll put it on a television set and we'll pull the camera back while it's animating. And another decision I make was, okay, we wanted to show these guys fighting in a battle scene, so we'll film it like a documentary camera where the cameraman's way far away from the action. Originally, this was just supposed to be a battle. I don't know, are you guys familiar with this scene at all? I guess not. So what happens is, it says a patriotic thing about our boys keeping the peace in Canada, and then this guy goes over and shoots that guy in the back of the head, and then they wave at the camera. So this was a good example of our dark humor, the way these things came about was I started to work on this scene, and I'm like, okay, how do I make a battle scene? How do I make a battle scene interesting? So I wanted to add a story to it, so this is just what kind of came out of that. We were constantly trying to push the envelope, and we had the attitude of, no one would ever do this, so we definitely should. It was almost like a dare where we were pushing each other as far as we could to see what we could get away with. We figured out, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't played it, you were the vault dweller and you save the vault, and at the end they kick you out of the vault because you'd be a bad influence because you're this heroic figure, and plus you've been tainted because the vault is very xenophobic. They don't like people from the outside. But this came to us fairly late in the game. We had already designed a lot of the game. We'd already made a lot of the game. When I started to make this, the outro as we called it, I'm like, how am I going to make a celebration scene? You were supposed to come back to a hero's welcome. I believe balloons were discussed at a certain point in time. It just didn't feel like it would be very dramatic or fun, but it also didn't make sense once we really thought about what was going on. There was no way that those people were letting you back inside that vault. And once again, Tim trusted us because he looked very scared when we told him that you were being kicked out of the vault at the end. So thank you, Tim. But bookending the game with the intro, and then this, I really feel it started the game with a certain mood and then left you with a certain mood. I feel this is a very Mad Max 2 Road Warrior kind of influence, because if you're familiar with Mad Max 2, it's kind of like told as a legend from the future. So at the end of the movie, when you find out what was really going on, it kind of changes how you felt about the whole movie. And for me, I felt like this did the same thing for the game. You played this whole game, you're used to video games, you come back, you win the game, you're a hero, you're kicked out, you walk away into the sunset alone and dejected, and I felt that that kind of retroactively colored everything that you had experienced about the game. This was meant to be an Easter egg. You can't really see it up there. It says number 2, because that was me being witty. This is a scene from our original design for Fallout 2. This was a renegade Brotherhood of Steel soldier coming upon you while you were being attacked by these creatures called lobotomites. However, the story was rejected. So this became a very obscure Easter egg because lobotomites didn't even make it into Fallout 2. I really never thought about it until I was putting this together, but players, I'm sure, were just like, what is this supposed to be? Because there was no reference to it. But like I said, lobotomites didn't make it in, but I was very happy when I played the New Vegas DLC Old World Blues, and there were my lobotomites. After the story was rejected, me, Tim, and Jason kind of hunkered down, and we came up with the new story for Fallout 2 in a day. And the next day, we ran into work, and we said, we have this great idea. We have to put this ad for the Garden of Eden creation kit inside the manual, which was the MacGuffin, or what the whole story of Fallout 2 was about. Trammell did the art on this, and Chris Taylor did the writing. This was literally the last minute before it went to the publishers, so I think it had to go to the publishers that night. We also designed, me, Tim, and Jason, a lot of the additions and changes to the game for Fallout 2, such as how followers were going to work, because in Fallout 1 they were very hacked in, they were just scripted, they weren't coded at all. The other thing we came up with that I thought was really neat was that the vaults were experiments. That was never the intent in Fallout 1, but the vaults were all these experiments that the government was doing on people to kind of test for long-range space travel. And then this was the cover that I wanted to make I wanted to put onto Fallout 2. They used it for a loading screen, I believe. A guy named Gary Plattner did the background for it. But this is what I like to call our slide into marketing hell. For some bizarre reason, marketing came to us and they wanted us to put non-skippable ads on the game, on the CD, which would have meant that every time you started the game, you had to watch all of these ads. You could not skip them. Tim argued with them for a long time. They wouldn't budge. So Tim changed our JPEG compression so that it always looked like our game was too big to fit on the CD until the very last minute, and he changed our JPEG compression back, and we shipped it. Sorry, we didn't have room for the ads. Another thing they wanted to do was put in this tutorial at the beginning called the Temple of Trials, which was also unskippable. I have no idea what their fascination with unskippable content was, but we really didn't want to do that. We thought that this was, you're going to hopefully play this game several times, and it's a tedious slog through this thing. For us, it was just this holy temple where you went to get your blessed vault suit at the beginning of the game. So this kind of really hit home that there was just way too much focus on us now. A lot of Fallout 1, we were kind of just ignored in a corner, doing whatever we wanted to do, which was great. All of a sudden, they were paying attention to us. We didn't like that. We really realized that Fallout had been such a great experience that we didn't want it to go bad for us. We wanted to remember it as this great experience. And the other thing was that Interplay had this fantastic culture. From the very beginning when we started there, it was a great place to work, and that was kind of slipping away. So Jason, Tim, and I decided to leave and form our own company called Troika Games. And one of our main goals was to try to recreate that Interplay culture. One of the things we did not realize, though, was that as owners of a company, you do not get to partake in that culture. According to the employees who worked for us, they said we were very successful at it, so I'm proud of that. I would have liked to have experienced it myself. It took us about 5 months to land our first contract. We didn't find out till later this was extremely quick, especially for a brand new studio who hadn't really done anything before. A guy named Scott Lynch, who eventually went to work at Valve, was running Sierra at the time, and he personally signed us. He had a tremendous amount of faith in us, which leads us to Arcanum. This was designed during the 5 months we were looking for a contract. We really wanted to explore what would happen if an industrial revolution came to a fantasy world with the prejudices, class issues, everything else that happened in our world with an industrial revolution. A lot of fantasy worlds to us felt like they were stuck in the 14th century. We did not understand why that had to be that way. They also felt kind of shallow. Characters in those worlds were kind of based on what they did. They didn't feel like real human beings to us. And we wanted to really explore what would happen to a world if you had magic and technology clashing. What would the political realities would be of that? How would people, or the people in the world, act like real people, even if they did happen to be elves and dwarves? I personally did all the portraits in the game, but when you do all the portraits, about half the animations, character modeling, and texturing, and write a good portion of the game, a couple bad ones might slip in. So these are some of the ones I actually like. I used my friends, co-workers, and Civil War photos as reference for these. Tim and Chris Jones, who came over with us, made awesome tools for us. Tim is a programmer who thinks like a designer, which is the best thing you can have on a team. Chad Moore was the other main writer on the game with me, and Tim knew that we had never scripted anything in our game. This is a picture of our scripting system that Tim built for us. It was all with drop-down menus. We didn't have to type anything. It was impossible to make syntax errors. It was really easy to use. It literally allowed me and Chad to script the whole game, even though we had never done anything like that before. He gave us so many options and so much freedom to do whatever we want with this, we totally made him regret it. And if any of you becomes a game programmer, or I guess a programmer of any kind, The best advice I could give you is that if a designer or an artist comes to you and tells you what they want to do, they're probably going to tell you how they think it should be done. And what you should do is find out what they want to do and why they want to do it and give them better solutions. Because a lot of times what artists and designers think is really hard is easy and vice versa. I can't count the number of times that I went to Tim with an idea and he gave me back a better version of it that I could do way more with, and it was easier for him to code. I think that's the overall theme of Arcanum, actually. From a development standpoint, it's really important to have great tools. Having these tools was what allowed us to make this game with so few people compared to Fallout. Another great tool is our world editor. Once again, this is not rocket science anymore, but at the time it was just completely amazing to us. If I put, this is a grass field, if I put one tile of deep water in the middle of that, it would automatically transition from deep water to shallow water to sand to dirt and then to grass. So you could just paint this in, you didn't have to place them all by hand. In Fallout, it was really difficult to do these things, like building buildings was a time-consuming process. We had one guy who was committed to doing it the whole game. That was his job. Tim always liked to joke we replaced him with a button. What you had to do is go top down and just drag out a rectangle and you had a house. If you dragged out another rectangle intersecting it, it would automatically just drop the intersecting walls and you could just start dropping down interior walls, do whatever you want. It was really easy. Once again, me and Chad and Jason and a couple other people made all of the maps for the game. It really was that easy. When you put down walls, they'd automatically have doors and windows in them that you could cycle through or delete them or add. Really easy tool to use. The problem with that is, and this is true in Fallout too, but when Arcanum came out, it was already looking very dated because it makes everything look very square and flat. And you have very limited lighting options. Everything looks like it's laid out on a grid and it's very obvious. We revised this process for Temple of Elemental Evil, where we switched to fully rendered backgrounds, but that really cost us the ability to move quickly. This system, as well as the fact that most of it was text-based, not dialogue, recorded dialogue-based, allowed us to move really quickly and implement any crazy idea we came up with. We paid a lot of attention to not only the main story arc, but silly little side quests we put in. This quest was, you were told to cover yourself in urine to disguise your scent as you hunted the dreaded Vorpal bunny that could change into a monster. Of course, when you capture the Vorpal bunny and bring it to a researcher, he's just like, no, this is just a rabbit. I don't know why you did this. And then, of course, if you did this quest, when you run into it later in the game, it actually does turn into this monster you have to fight. In this game, we used 8 rotations instead of 6 because we did not start out with GURPS, so we based everything on square tiles. One of the ways we used to combat this square flatness was what we used to call facades, and what all that was we'd render out a full picture and then just cut it into tiles. It didn't have to tile with anything else, but you can see how flat it obviously is, but you put that in the game, it looks like this 3D object. And all these tiles were automatically blocked. We didn't have to do that by hand. And now we come to the magic of G:. This is one of the best things that Tim ever came up with. He had to convince us to use it. G stands for greeting. When you would put this at the beginning of a dialogue, it would automatically grab a generic greeting from a list based on the reaction of the NPC to your character. What race you were, what class, whether they loved or hated you, whether you were beautiful or ugly, whether you had been turned into a sheep, or whether you're wearing barbarian armor in a big city. This alone made the game feel extremely reactive without us having to do a lot of extra scripting. And besides the initial class reaction matrix we built, it was very easy to extend it to include things like if you happened to run around Tarrant in your underwear for a quest, or for whatever reason you decided to cover yourself in urine, NPCs would react to this and comment on it. And our goal, as always, was to allow the player to do anything they want, as well as let them know that the game was reacting to it. Another way we did this was through newspapers. They would report on things you had done and choices you had made. And this was a quick and easy way for us to kind of reinforce that all those choices and the things that you were doing were affecting the world. These had just awesome formatting and font options. All of this was done through a text file. I don't know how amazing it was for anybody else, but this was revolutionary to us at the time. We would have had to, previous to this, we would have had to create the art and do different art for every newspaper we were doing, but this was all just done by text files. We really were committed to letting you play however you want. One of the things that we did that we were very adamant about at the time was letting you kill everybody in the game. There was one character you couldn't kill in the game, but she was a ghost, so we felt that that wasn't cheating. I don't know if it was the first, but it's definitely one of the first games where you could literally kill everybody in the game and play the whole main story arc from start to finish. You could walk into a room, kill the quest giver before he even opened his mouth, and you'd be able to find somewhere in his room the information you needed. To us, this was the ultimate in letting the player do what he wanted to do. This is about, like I said, we really wanted to deal with class and oppression and racism. So the orcs were basically your oppressed underclass in this game. And so they took over, they were striking and they took over a factory. And of course, we gave you all the normal ways to solve the quest. You could talk them out of it. You could go in there and kill them. One of my favorite ways was you could go in there and if you were a talking character with a very high charisma and persuasion, you could convince them to go on a murderous rampage throughout the whole city, which basically made the city unusable for the whole rest of the game, which was a big deal because that was the biggest city in the game. But we were crazily committed to letting you do whatever you wanted. When you do things like this, or when you're telling this magnificent story that you're really committed to, you also have to be really committed to not forcing the player to do what you want them to do or what you think they should do. You need to give them space to create their own story because they're going to create a way better story than you can. When they talk about the game with their friends, they're often going to talk about their interpretation of what happened, so you need to make sure you give them the room to have that kind of experience. This was the whole entire team that developed Arcanum. The great and easy to use tools allowed us to make a giant game with only 12 people and an intern. Similar sized games at the time were using anywhere between 30 and 50 people. However, if you make a game this size with only 12 people, it might end up kind of buggy. There were so many paths and combinations, it wasn't really feasible for us to adequately test them all, especially with this small of a team. Also, our focus on letting the player do virtually anything they wanted, make whatever characters and choices they wanted, also meant that players could make characters that were basically unviable by about halfway through the game, which is probably not a good design idea. We tried to make, I didn't do this either, this was done by another artist at our company. We tried to make a full 3D sequel to it called Journey to the Center of Arcanum, but that fell through, as did a hardcore isometric RPG based on Lord of the Rings, because who would want a hardcore RPG based on Lord of the Rings? After that, we had only 2 weeks to make payroll, which, if you know anything about the game industry, is a virtual impossibility. So I called Scott Lynch, who was at Valve at this time. Thank you, Scott. And he hooked us up with Activision to make a role-playing game using the Half-Life 2 source engine and the Vampire license, which Activision had at the time. Side note here, the main lesson to take away from this, never ever develop a game with a third-party unfinished engine. We knew that at the time, but we had no choice. Like I said, we had 2 weeks. So we were able to make payroll, never missed a payroll. The reason I have this up here is during this time, I negotiated the contract for Temple. That was pretty much all I did on that. That was the fun of being a CEO of your own company. It wasn't something we fought over. It was something we fought not to be, and I drew the short straw, so I had to do things like negotiate contracts. I'm only going to be giving kind of like a top-level overview of Vampire and Diablo. You guys can ask me questions about any of that stuff later. I just got a lot to get through. Vampire was our first full 3D game. I didn't do this piece either. It was a very difficult project, to say the least. I had to act like a grown-up, which sucked. I had to run the project and run interference with the publisher. I mentioned before how the engine was unfinished. Valve was understandably continually changing the engine so that it would work really well for Half-Life 2, be the best engine they had for Half-Life 2. But as you can imagine, the needs for a Half-Life 2 type shooter and an RPG are very different. That, along with Valve's pace of production, which is very relatively unhurried and unconcerned about time and budget, at least as far as we were concerned, or compared to us, led to no end of issues between us and our publisher. I will repeat that. The fact that they kept changing their engine and we couldn't move faster than them led to issues between us and the publisher, not between the publisher and Valve, because that's the way things work. We were the low man on the totem pole, so they would call us up and complain to us about how the engine wasn't finished. So eventually this made us split the engine off from Valve's, which was also not the best idea. We finished it ourselves. Besides being a barrier between the publisher and the team, I also did some writing, a lot of editing, and I wrote the main story arc with Jason and Chad. I didn't end up doing any modeling or animating. I just did concept art and texture mapping as far as art went. We were still trying to evoke our core values of letting the players play however they want with branching dialogue and choices. We really wanted the different vampire clans to all feel different when you played them. We really wanted to nail the mood and tone of the vampire setting, which was an established world that a lot of people were fans of. Jason was really the one who was responsible for us getting that right. What we did was we started out by digging into what made these characters human, even though they were vampires, much like we did with Arcanum and Fantasy. We switched over to TV news broadcasts from Arcanum newspapers, but they filled the same purpose or the same function. They commented on and reacted to your actions. And even though the game had a lot of our type of reactivity and multiple paths, I really feel the second half suffers from not a lot of that, especially the boss battles focused way too much on combat. Jason worked with a guy named Rick Schaefer, who we hired from out of house as a sound guy, and they really nailed the music and sound to create this great mood. Margaret Schaefer, Rick's wife, did genius work voice directing and getting us top-notch actors, sometimes for much less than they usually charge people. But even this, due to our limited budget, wasn't enough. So we had to supplement that with the team doing voices. Some of them turned out really good, some of them not so great. Even with all that, I think that one of the reasons people liked this game so much was because it had really excellent voice acting. I personally get the prize for the worst voice acting, and I'm not going to tell you which character it was because it's extremely embarrassing. But I also got to play a conspiracy theorist who rants on call-in radio talk shows, so that was kind of fun and not half bad. This was the Ocean House level. I think it's the best level, one of the best levels in the game. It was all about atmosphere. It was a haunted house. It was not about dialogue. It was not about the normal things you see in an RPG. But the problem was it really wasn't working. We wanted to evoke a mood and a feeling of unease and horror throughout the whole thing, using things like newspapers and children's drawings and scripted events as opposed to dialogue. No one could get this right. We worked on it for months and months and months. And then finally Jason took it and locked himself in his office for a few days and really knocked it out of the park. He made it work. He scripted it. He really nailed the pacing. People often, besides me, say that this is a really good example of level design, and I just don't feel like Jason gets enough credit for that, so I wanted to call him out. Whoops, skipped a slide there. In Fallout and Arcanum, if you lowered your intelligence too much, you got dumb dialogue choices, which means you were barely intelligible, which again, another way that we wanted you to be able to play the game. In Vampire, Malkavians were crazy, so they were Vampire's version of it. So they did things like argue with stop signs. And newscasters on TV, which unlike the stop signs, the newscasters on TV would argue back. The Nosferatu also had a distinctly different path through the game. They couldn't let themselves be seen by humans without violating the masquerade, which was this thing of not letting people know, human beings know, that vampires exist. So they had to use the sewers and find back entrances. A few weeks before we shipped the game, we found a bug. Well, we didn't find it. QA found a bug where the Nosferatu couldn't finish the game. It took us a long time. We finally tracked it down, and we discovered that that bug had been in there since the very beginning of the game, which meant that you could never finish the game as a Nosferatu. And it turns out QA had not been playing the game as Nosferatu. I have no idea why, but these are the kind of things you run into when you're making video games. Despite all this, I believe we made at least half of a great game. A lot of people still love it and are still patching it even 10 years later. I think this was our last E3. Regardless, this perfectly captures the level of both our physical and mental exhaustion. They decided to release Vampire the same day as Half-Life 2, which was as soon as contractually possible to the minute. I'm not a businessman, obviously, but I don't think that's a good idea. We couldn't get any new contracts, so we decided to close while we still had enough money to pay off all of our employees, pay them for their vacations, and even give some of them bonuses. Because it was always very important to us to be good employers as well as teammates. And we feel very proud that we were able to do that. And we closed on February 1st of 2005. I took some time off, which turned into about a year. Me, Tim, and Chris Taylor met with Brian Fargo, and we did a pitch doc initial design for Wasteland 2. He'd never given up trying to make that game, but he couldn't find a publisher to fund it. Years later, when he eventually got it funded through Kickstarter, he asked to use the early version of this piece that I had done. It was kind of just a real quick sketch, but I didn't think it was good enough, so I repainted it for him. This is based off another sketch that I did for a Wasteland 2 doc. I like to call this Buddy's Revenge, and this is Buddy plotting his revenge. A day short of the year from the closing of Troika, I started at Blizzard on D3 on January 31st of 2006. This was lucky again. Just when I really started to look for a job, they called me. I had given them my resume about 6 months before, and I had heard nothing, and then they called me out of the blue. It was also lucky that people who I had worked with back in the Interplay days were working there now, and they could vouch for me. I think you can see a theme developing here. I didn't do any art on Diablo, so all the rest of the slides are going to be other people's art. In case you can't read it, which you definitely can't because it's off the top of the screen there, this article is titled "The Tragedy of Leonard Boyarsky." And when people are spending time to write articles about the tragedy of your life, you know you've done something right. This was definitely a high point of my career. This story was about how I'd been hired after pitching the idea of adding a branching storyline with player choice and corruption to Diablo. This turns out to not really be a good idea due to the pace of that game. But we didn't realize it at the time, so we built this complex storyline with many moving parts. And we didn't revise it once we moved away from the slower gameplay. We also decided to remove side quests for similar gameplay issues or pacing issues. And I think this hurt the game in the long run a lot because that made us take everything we wanted to have the player experience and shove it into the main story arc, whether it made sense or not. Eventually, we came up with these things called events that became our side quests. But by then, it was too late to revise the main story line and streamline it and remove the clunky parts. I still believe the basic story we were trying to tell was a good one, but our delivery left something to be desired. I especially like the early work I did on the game. I created the character of Abdel Hazir for the announcement website, including his personality and his unreliable and arrogant lore entries. I also had a lot of fun writing Leorg's journal about his descent into madness that you had heard about before but you had never experienced. I also got to do a lot to expand the Diablo universe. I came up with new cultures and civilizations and backstories for the first few of the new classes, which was really satisfying as well as a lot of the side content. I loved coming up with dozens and dozens of mini stories for the legendary items. That was a really creative part. Reaper was better because we knew what the game was and we streamlined the storytelling. I really pushed for follower quests because I wanted to dig deeper into who your followers were. So we adapted our event system to handle them. This was really important because this meant we did not force players to experience them. Players could choose whether to have them or not, which kept them off the main story arc. And this was necessitated by the fact that we adapted our event system to do it. So once again, constraints are very important. More so here because this proved to the rest of the team that less could actually be more in a fast-paced RPG. Because most people ended up playing them. But we didn't have to force them, so it made people feel like they had a choice and they weren't being railroaded. Another thing I did on this project, as well as a couple other people, was starting to experiment with chained events, as I like to call them, which were, you could experience them in any random order, and depending on how you experienced them, they could change the meaning or the feeling you had about them. I wish we could have worked a lot more of that into the game. We were able to explore this further in 2 patches that we made right before I left. I felt we really finally distilled a way to combine effective nonlinear storytelling with the fast-paced gameplay. I think my favorite Diablo thing, though, was a very small thing, and that was the naming and writing the flavor text for the Legacy of Raycor set. If you recall, my daughter's name was Corey Ray. I think you can see where I'm going with this. She was getting married, and both her and her fiancé were very big Diablo players. I mean, I thought, what better present, or what better unique present, that something that they couldn't get from anybody else than to design their own legendary set of armor. The flavor text for this set of armor told the tale of the undying love affair between the very first female barbarian war master, named Raycor, and a warrior that she rescues from certain death who is named after her fiancé. But I really missed branching story and character choice, so I decided to leave Blizzard after 10 years and work at Obsidian to make in-depth RPGs again. As an Obsidian creative director, I really get to merge art and story again, which I really missed. It's something I feel I do best when I'm working on both sides of that. And it's like coming home in a lot of ways. There's a lot of people there who are both from Interplay and Troika. But most importantly, I'm working with Tim to create another brand new IP, something we haven't done together since 2001. If I had to sum all this up as advice to you, I would tell you to crank your luck up to heroic levels. But barring that, I would say, more importantly, and this is true in any industry and life in general, always strive to do your job the best you can and be good to the people you work with, especially the people who work for you. Chris Jones is an Obsidian owner now. He was an employee of ours at Troika, and he was very instrumental in me coming over to Obsidian. And so I just want to say thank God I was very nice to him, and thank you all for listening to me drone on for so long.
right, guys. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone in the audience?
Should we leave this up during questions?
Could you please stand up when you
Thanks.
stand up?
One question. Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry. Working creatively as an artist, how do you find is the best way to communicate or learn more from the programming side or the more technical side and incorporate both those things into a complete work?
If you work in computer games especially, you can't avoid it because you have to kind of figure out how these things are going in the game and know your tools as well as how the programmers are going to implement things. But the best way to do it, if you are interested in computer gaming, is to start at a small company or even an independent studio or even just make a game with some of your friends, because then you can experience all facets of making computer games. If you go straight to working at a big company where, let's say, you're just doing modeling or just texture mapping, you're going to have a very small view of what's actually going on in the bigger game. So yeah, that's probably the best way to go about it.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? Right there in the front. Could you please stand up?
Thank you, first of all. Being someone who worked on Arcanum, of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, why is it that you think that particular kind of aesthetic, the science meets fantasy kind of aesthetic, kind of steamwork-ish, steampunk-ish actually, why is it not used more often in RPGs as of late, or at least not as often as most other kinds of RPGs?
I'm probably not the person to ask about that because I think it should be used more. I would love to see it used a lot more. I think it's, in a lot of ways, people want stuff that they're familiar with. It was our way of doing a fantasy game kind of without doing a traditional fantasy game, and I think it's a safer bet to do a straight fantasy game, or at least people believe it's a safer bet. I believe if you make any game good enough, it'll find an audience, but you have to go to publishers and get money and prove them. So I think games cost so much money these days, especially AAA titles, that people want to kind of put it in a safer bet. So that's my best guess.
Yeah, I guess. And secondly, really quick, as someone who backed both Pillars of Eternity and Deathfire,
thank you.
Is there something you can give us a sneak peek of Deathfire, what's it's coming along?
I'm not working on that title at all, so I don't have. No, me and Tim are working on our own project.
When you said new IP, you meant something else at Obsidian?
Yes, something else totally different.
Not yet revealed?
Nope.
Oh.
And I cannot talk about it.
Okay.
So that's the next question.
Okay.
We have one more in the front.
Yeah, hey, thank you for sharing your story about your career progression that more or less was tied to growth of the industry. Currently, with the industry more established, let's say, do you find it hard to help young people start their careers as a lead?
Well, it's really hard because when I was working at Troika, we could help people out. We had interns, but we didn't have that big of a team. And then when I was at Blizzard, I really wasn't involved in a lot of hiring. There was some hiring we did. We had some interns, so I mentored them. And now on this project, we are hiring people, and I try to work with everybody that I can. I probably should do more of it and figure out ways to do more of it. But as you can see, I kind of took an unorthodox path through the gaming world. I think the best thing I can tell you is to get in there and get your feet wet and start making it. And it's in a lot of ways. It's easier today. I don't know about easier to get into the industry, but it's easier to learn the things you need to because you can get things like, for instance, the Neverwinter Nights tool set or even the Half-Life, or the GEC from the Fallout games. You can build your own games with these things with a lot of the assets already there to not only learn, but to prove and put that in your portfolio to show that you know how to do those things.
All right. Anyone else?
All right, so what's your favorite game?
Fallout.
Okay, I'll take it.
On the right side.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to ask that working at Obsidian Entertainment, have you also worked with the Paradox Interactive?
I'm sorry?
Have you worked with the Paradox Interactive, the publisher?
Oh, no, I haven't worked with Paradox at all. That's the Tyranny team, right? That's what you're talking about?
Yes.
No, I haven't worked with them at all.
Thank you.
We've got time for 2 more questions.
Excuse me. I really like the presentation. I'm a
Thank you.
big fan of your work. I have a question about the first Fallout game.
Sure.
I had from the presentation that you gave me an idea that it was a fun game for you.
Yes.
It was something that you wanted to do and you had a vision, and it was kind of just a few guys making something they liked. Did you expect it to be as successful as it was? Or did you just do it for the experience of making a game that you loved?
Both. We loved it, and we were young, and we were headstrong and kind of arrogant. So we thought, we think this is the best thing ever, so everybody else will. It turns out not everybody else did. It sold well, but it wasn't a huge hit by any stretch of the imagination. It didn't become really big until Bethesda took it over. But what did happen was a lot of the people who got into the industry and who got into the press especially really liked it. So it was weird. It's like there would be certain days where we're just like, we're making this game for ourselves. We're going to sell it to 5 people, and we will have had a good time. And there were other days where we're like, this is going to change the world. So.
Well, it certainly did. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Last question. The remaining questions, we have time. You can answer them in the showcase area afterwards.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi. First of all, thank you for making Fallout 1. It's really a favorite of mine.
Thank
My
you.
question is, because you worked on RPGs with branching stories and all of that, and technology wasn't as advanced as it is today, what do you feel that has evolved in that way, because you're working on branching stories, has evolved, and what's the things that you feel like it hasn't evolved, it's still hard to work around? So I wanted to know a bit about what's changed, what's easier these days, what's still stuck in the past along that way.
Well, one of the reasons, besides the fact that not everybody, but a lot of people who work at Obsidian are people I've worked with before, one of the reasons I went there is because I feel like they're the only people who are really truly making the kind of RPGs that I like. And by that I mean we are really committed to you making your own character, and it's kind of like I talked about in the talk. As you're going through this game, we don't want to say, well, the player has to do this. You can do all this other stuff, but you have to do this. Our goal is always to make it so the player doesn't have to do anything. And of course, most players will, but we want players to be able to find other ways. And there's a lot of RPGs who do that, but I still feel that, especially with all the money that's in them, and the voice acting, and the cutscenes, with all that stuff, I think they've put other people have put more energy into figuring out ways to try to make you want to do what they want you to do, which is, our approach is a little bit more risky, I guess. As far as the tools, I think Obsidian, and this isn't just because I work there, I have only worked there for 8 months or so, almost a year. And their dialogue tool is fantastic. It's the best dialogue tool I've worked with. On Arcanum, we used Excel spreadsheets, which was actually really good. I mean, Tim made it so we could change the Excel spreadsheets and not even restart the game, and the conversations would change, which once again was amazing to us at the time. But yeah, they have this flowchart system that you can see your whole conversation. It's really great. Like I said, I don't think you can do a whole lot. You can make the tool, you can make it easier to implement, maybe easier to test, but there's really not a lot you can do except to make it easier to create the content, because until we have AI, the computers can't react like a human being can. Does that answer your question?
I'm sorry. Thank you so much for your time. As I said before, if there are any questions left, I'm sure Leonard will love to talk to you in the showcase area. Thank you so much for your presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we did, and I think it really deserves a big round of applause.